What is this? Well, today we talk about 5 of my favorite weird, wild, and wacky Gibson guitars. And what a doozy coming in at number 5. And these aren't in any order of weird because they're all weird, wild, and wacky. Is this weird, wild, and wacky Gibson 1983 Futura in pearl white. You might be thinking to yourself, Benny, wasn't the prototype of the Explorer from 1957 known as the Gibson Futura? Yeah, it was. Benny, wasn't there a Les Paul like 10 years ago that had a P90 and some wacky colors named the Gibson Futura? You're also right. It's because Gibson names guitars the same things over and over. But this is, I won't even say the OG Futura because the 57's the OG. This is the second Futura from 1983. And you're probably saying to yourself, well, that thing looks weird. You're correct. That's because this comes from a very strange time in the 80s when CeCe DeVille and Bret Michaels were spraying their Aquanet with their 70 girls in the back, and Tommy Lee was running through the streets naked. It was a strange time to be alive. And during that time, there was a company called Steinberger that made headless guitars. And Gibson said, we should get in on that. So Chuck Burge, who was working at Kalamazoo at Gibson at the time, designed this guitar. Now, it was designed to be headless, which I firmly believe that if it was released now, people would buy these things like crazy because, you got Strandbergs and all kinds of other guitars that are headless. People love it. But back in '83, when Chuck Burge made the headless version of this guitar, which, by the way, had all the tuning pegs down here kind of like a BC Rich, he sent it over to Nashville and they said, "Niet," or 9, or "lo" in Hebrew, which is also no in English. No, we're not doing that. Did it stop there? No. They decided to put this crazy headstock on it. So let's just take a look at what this guitar actually is. Now, please, before I show you, do not confuse this guitar with the Gibson Corvus, which was a cheaper version of this guitar made of alder. It was a bolt-on, and it had a rosewood fretboard, a wraparound tailpiece, and the output jack was right here. This is a much higher end and way cooler guitar than that. This is in pearl white, not to be confused with Alpine white. This has some flecky flecks in it, very subtle. And of course, if you look at this one, it's got some cool checking from its age. But you have a multi-ply pick guard. You got these 2 Bill Lawrence Alnico pickups that are epoxy sealed, very indicative of this 1980s time period. You have a Tune-O-Matic down here, which much better than the wraparound adjustable tailpiece found on the Corvus. And one of the most important things for me is instead of having the output on the pickguard here to be ripped out very easily, you have the output jack right on the side here. Now, the coolest thing about this guitar is that it is milled from one piece of maple. I have never seen this with Gibson. This is all one piece. It's a neck-through design from Gibson. Gibson tuners on the back. And when they put this headstock on, I went to go look and figure out what the actual name of this headstock was. And Bruce Bolin, who was the head of R&D at the time at Gibson, named it the Limp Dick headstock. Apt, Bruce. I would concur. Not only is it a really cool guitar, but it sounds awesome. Recently, Gibson just put the prototype, they must have taken it out of the vault wherever it was hidden under somebody's bed, and sold it for $25,000. I don't know if that's how I would spend my money. It's the first headless, and actually the only headless Gibson guitar I'm at least aware of off the top of my head. Look at this thing. 1 Alnico 5 pickup, the tuner's right on the body. Thing's wild, clearly from the island of Dr. Moreau. And many people refer to this guitar as the Pac-Man guitar, making it number 5 on our weird, wild, and wacky list. Coming in at number 4 is my personal favorite Norland era guitar that I own. The 1985 Gibson DC400 XPL. And XPL, as you can see from the headstock, stands for Explorer. So no, this is not a Les Paul, it's not a double cut Les Paul, it's an Explorer. It's super light, it's only about 7.8 pounds. You have this awesome Kahler bridge, which I personally like Kaler bridges better than Floyd's, although I'm not a locking guy. You have on-off pickup selectors and kind of this double cut Les Paul thing going with an ebony fretboard. And at the very top, this beautiful scimitar headstock, which just makes it badass and ready to rock and roll. And if you're curious to see how this thing sounds, I have a whole video demoing this guitar. It's great. When I was 13, I walked into EU Wurlitzer in Worcester, Massachusetts, and I said, I want that. Because it was a Gibson I could afford. It was $599. And I believe I was scraping the lead paint off my dad's garage for like $4 an hour to save up for this thing. True story. It had a Dirty Fingers pickup inside, and that promptly died. Just like these 3 toggle switches, which I've noticed with a lot of the Norland era guitars I have, those are the first things to go. So I went down to this place called Radio Shack. Remember that place? And I actually got these toggles on my lunch break at the music store I worked at and had my buddy put these in. What a novel time to be alive. You could actually go get guitar parts from the mall. It came in multiple layouts. This is the Hum single. I've seen another version with 2 Tim Shaws that's like a Les Paul with the 3-way selector. This kind of almost has that Charvel on-off Model 4, Model 6 thing going. And of course, you can split the humbucker right there with the speed knob. I love how it plays now, but when I got it, whatever flat profile frets were on it, just terrible. Just terrible. In fact, it bummed me out for years. I didn't play this thing, but when I finally put jumbo frets on this guitar, it came alive for me. You can obviously see why this is number 4 on my list of weird, wild, and wacky. You have a double cut Les Paul Explorer with toggle switches. Sticking with the toggle switches that break, I have number 3 on my list. The 1988 Gibson WRC SR71. Part of the Signature series from Gibson at the time, which featured, I want to say, Chet Atkins and Johnny Smith and B.B. King, and a guy named Wayne Charvel. You know, as in Charvel Guitars. He came over in 1987 for a very short period to Gibson and essentially made what looks like almost identical to a Model 4 Charvel, but with a Gibson name on it. In fact, this guitar pretty much disappeared after 1988 because Jackson sued them and said, stop making Gibson Jackson. Stop it. Just stop it. There are some serious differences between this guitar and some of the other versions of this guitar. The first being, it has 4 toggles instead of 3. So instead of just turning on and off each pickup, you have a direct kill die switch, as I call them. It's a bypass directly to the lead. So if you want to just have, you know, your middle pickup on and be rocking and rolling on some rhythms and then boop, right to lead, that works. This one has a Kaler bridge on it, although the later iteration had a Floyd Rose. It has a nice little carve here, which is also very different than the carve that showed up on the normal version of it that was later produced. Let's look at this logo. Man, I love this. This looks like it's from like the 1930s and should say the Gibson. The normal production model has a fatter headstock than this. This one has Bill Lauren's pickups in it. They are epoxied and these are stacked humbuckers. This is just a normal humbucker. A lot of the showcase editions came with EMGs, but as you can see that this is clearly not modded. The EMG version has a plate down here for the 9-volt battery. So this never was EMGs. Another really wild thing about this is the contour on the back. I don't know like what being Wayne was making this for, but this certainly doesn't go against anybody's normal body shape. And something especially weird about this version is it doesn't say Showcase Edition on the back, despite it being a Showcase Edition. You want to see really weird WRC, check out this guitar. That is the prototype of the WRC, and it's made all in Nautilus shell by Wayne himself. Look at that. They want like $47 million for it. It is a solid mollusk, crazy, weird Norland thing. I want it. I'm not gonna sell my kidney for it. Now, number 2 on my list is the Gibson Nighthawk. I love this guitar. This is my first Gibson. And I'm holding this too because this is my second Gibson. So if you guys want to understand like a little bit about nature, nurture, why is Benny so weird? Why is he so neurotic? That's kind of how I got into guitars, is through weird, wild, and wacky Gibsons. I bought it with my bar mitzvah money. You know, when you're 13 years old in the Jewish community and you go and you read from the Torah, and then all your friends give you money like it's your quinceañera, but you're 13 and you're Jewish. I remember going down to Daddy's Junkie Music and being like, I need that guitar. My dad made me go home. He's like, you're not going to spend $850 on a guitar without thinking about it. I thought about it. I want that guitar. So as soon as I woke up at like 4:30 in the morning, I told my dad, we're going. It doesn't open until 10 o'clock, and I sat there waiting to go buy this guitar. And this came in multiple iterations. There's a 2 pickup iteration and a 3 pickup iteration. And of those iterations, there are 3 other iterations. There's the special, which only had dot inlays. There's the standard, and this is a standard 3, because obviously 3 pickups, that had parallelogram inlays. And then you have the custom, which has an ebony fretboard, and it has these J200 crown inlays. So let's take a look at this thing. What a beautiful top on this guitar. You have a slant humbucker, you have an NSX single coil, and you have a mini hum in the neck position. Now this version, again being the custom version, has a ebony fretboard with mother of pearl J200 crown inlays, which I absolutely love. It's got a bound headstock. This version has the rosewood fretboard and the parallelogram inlays. And this is cool because this is a 1993. So if you look at these inlays, they're actually mother of pearl. After the first year, they stopped putting the mother of pearl on the standard. If you notice, the headstock has no binding. I'm going to talk about this standard 3, which, by the way, this is definitely a Corlick, not mother of pearl, not mollusk. Who doesn't like red sparkle? And it's got a black back and the custom shop logo on the back of the headstock. Now, the idea of these guitars was they were supposed to be like an amalgamation, a mix-up, a mashup, a remix of the Les Paul and a Fender Strat. First, starting off with the idea that it has a 25/5 scale is what you'll find on a normal Strat. Most Les Pauls and most Gibsons are going to be 24.75. It's also only about 7 pounds and change, so it's certainly a lot lighter than a Les Paul. I love this shape. I think it's super comfortable, this contour right here. But it's basically the Swiss Army knife of guitars. You have 3 distinctly different pickups with a crazy amount of different options. Take a look at this chart of all the different tones you can get out of this guitar. I loved how this guitar sounded so much when I first bought it. It was the standard for which I judged all other guitars for years. So certainly because it's my first Gibson and because it's so light and it feels so comfortable, I love this guitar. But it's weird, wild, and wacky because it's certainly not like any other Gibson. You got the Fender 25/5 scale and you got a whole array of different tones. You pull out the tone knob and it changes everything. Number 1 on my list is the Les Paul recording model. Those were in any order of weird, wild, and wacky. If they were going to be in order, number 1 would be this guitar. Because this is the mere space station of guitars. When most people think of Les Paul and a Les Paul guitar, they think of 2 humbuckers, a 3-way toggle, 2 volumes, and 2 tones. You got the super heavy mahogany body. Les Paul loved to use the output on this control plate, which I think is crazy because you can rip it right out. You don't have lead and rhythm, you have front and rear. A 3-way tone, a bass, a treble knob, something called the decade switch, a volume, a phase, and a low-high output, along with these 2 low impedance pickups, 22 frets, rosewood with these mother of pearl small block inlays. And then you have a split diamond headstock with the Les Paul recording model bound to the 9s. This is a solid, crazy mahogany machine. Heavy, probably pushing 10.5 pounds. To understand this guitar, I'm gonna go back to this guitar. This is Les Paul's missing 1955 prototype of the Les Paul recording model. So in the 50s, Les Paul wasn't really using normal Les Pauls. He was using guitars much more like this. Similar controls, similar control plate. You have the output on there, because if you look on the bottom of this, no output jack over there. Because Les Paul had been dreaming of this guitar for years before this came. This came in 1970. This is a 1955. So Les was doing this long before. The earlier iteration of this guitar was called the Les Paul Professional, which had this other crazy thing in it, an XLR input. Well, right in there, look at that volume. That's so Mary Ford and Les Paul could plug in their gooseneck microphones and control the volume of their vocals right from the guitar. When I got this guitar, it had 60s P90s in it, and none of this was working. And I've been trying to restore it to understand what it was really about. And I was able to track down Les Paul's original 1950s Stapleback P90s pickups that he rewired to be low impedance. So when I put these pickups back in, you couldn't hear anything because they're low impedance. They're meant to be plugged into a low impedance input, usually through an XLR connection. Your normal guitar amplifier is a high impedance input. And the idea would be that you couldn't possibly hear it through a normal amplifier without something like this, a low to high transformer. So if I want to hear this guitar through my normal amplifier, because these are rewound low impedance prototype pickups from Les Paul, I have to use this thing, which is important in understanding the Les Paul recording model. So check out this chart of what all these things do. But this part right here, the high to low output changes a low impedance signal to a high impedance signal. A signal that would only work directly to your board, you can then go to high output and use it through your normal guitar amplifier. Because this guitar has a transformer inside of it. What? And I don't mean Optimus Prime or Megatron. He actually put what you saw over inside this guitar. Let me read in his own words the idea behind the low impedance pickups, and in particular, the Les Paul recording model. For years, I've worked to produce a multitude of distinctive guitar sounds. And the hang-up was to obtain everything in one guitar. Now, I'm not talking about gimmickry. I'm talking about the real McCoy. Authentic guitar sounds, the type of highs that can rip your ears off, the type of bass response that's clean and clear, and every note must be balanced and offer maximum sustain. With normal pickups, you have something called a resonant peak. Different pickups have different sounds and they have different resonant peaks. What Les Paul wanted to do by making low impedance pickups was make the cleanest pickup possible. Where you have all of these companies like EMG and Fishman Fluence trying to make louder pickups, pickups for higher gain, Les Paul wanted to do the exact opposite of that. He wanted to make the cleanest pickups possible with an absolutely flat frequency with no resonant peak within any of the normal human hearing range. You could manipulate your tone to sound like almost anything. With this guitar came a record explaining how to get some of those weird tones, and Les Paul himself is talking on it. You got your normal volume control. Makes sense. Now you've got something called a decade switch. What? It is a 10-way toggle. And if you're thinking to yourself, I can buy that on Stu Mac. No, you can't. Each one of these rotary positions is associated with a different capacitor. Hold on, let me put on my nerdy hat. The more capacitance, the more treble bleed to ground. So the idea is that you would be limiting what high frequencies come through pending what capacitor you go to so that you can further manipulate your sound. Controlling the capacitance could affect your highs and lows of your guitar. One of the weirdest things about this is this 3-way tone. The second position should be your normal position because when you have it right here, all this stuff works. You can control what pickups you use, the whole nine, you have all this stuff. When you go to number 1, it makes it where you have both these pickups working simultaneously, so this is useless, and both the bass and the treble knobs are basically deactivated. You go over now to number 3, and you could still now use the selector, but the bass and treble controls become inactive. The idea was you get all these crazy tonal shapes and sounds, and then if you want to switch back and forth and do some impossible level switching, this 3-way tone could do that for you. Because I had this guitar, I was able to figure out everything about this guitar. It's taken me 2 years of understanding to be able to restore this guitar back to how it was in the 50s. And anyone that knows anything about Les Paul, it could be different on a Monday than it was on a Wednesday. Thank you for sticking around for my 5 weird, wacky, and wild Gibson guitars. And stay tuned for Les Paul's 1955 Lost recording model prototype.
Why don't you smash that subscribe button already?